Duskmourn spoilers are finally here, so double check your teeth, blow up a balloon or two, and let's break them down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffrona, and it's time for our first daily dose of Duskmourn spoilers. So Wizards just did a big stream from Pax West showing off a ton of Duskmourn, and the set looks amazing. The art is so good, the cards are so cool. We have a ton of stuff to talk about today, which means we should probably jump into it, start talking sweet new Duskmourn cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's start talking some Duskmourn. First up today, we get the big bad mythic Elder Demon of the set in Valgavoth Terror Eater. So it's a 9 mana 9/9 mythic Elder Demon. It is flying and lifelink, ward of sack 3 non-land permanents, arguably one of the strongest wards that we've ever seen. And then its ability is, if a card you didn't control would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead, and then during your turn you can play cards exiled with it, and if you cast a spell this way, pay life equal to its mana value rather than its mana cost. So Valgavoth, obviously an absurd card, right? It should be. It costs 9 mana, so it's going to be very hard to get this on the battlefield. But once you get this on the battlefield, you have a 9/9 flying lifelinker that some decks are really going to struggle to kill, and then it's going to very slowly generate card advantage, and then also mana advantage, because you can cast those cards for life rather than their mana value. So Valgavoth, if you think about what this is, it's essentially like this weird Leyline of the Void effect. Anything that goes into your opponent's graveyard that you didn't control. And that wording, I know it's kind of weird, like, why are they excluding cards that I control? And I think it's mostly to keep Valgavoth from going very easily infinite with itself. Let's say your opponent casts a Dark Ritual and it goes to exile, then during your turn you're like Dark Ritual, and then it went back to exile, and then Dark Ritual, and then Dark Ritual, and you just like make infinite mana. I think that's what Wizards was trying to do with the wording, is basically it makes it so you can only cast each spell that was exiled with Valgavoth once. Then it goes back to your opponent's graveyard, so you can't just keep casting again and again. So it's essentially this weird Leyline of the Void that then gives you a Bolas's Citadel for the cards that you exile with this Leyline of the Void mode. So the question for this card is, how does it compare to the other big, huge reanimation targets in Standard? Because at 9 mana, honestly, most decks are not going to be casting this. If you're getting this into play, you're reanimating it or show and telling it or something. So in Standard right now, and really in every format, Atraxa is the S-tier reanimation target. And I don't think that changes with Valgavoth. I think the thing about Valgavoth is, its card advantage is much slower than Atraxa. The upside of Atraxa is you just play this, immediately you draw like 5 cards or something, put you super far ahead. Valgavoth, its card advantage is much slower. You gotta play it, and then you need stuff to go in your opponent's graveyard, so you gotta make them discard or kill their stuff or mill them or something. So as far as a card advantage engine, it is much, much slower than Atraxa. On the other hand, Valgavoth does have one big upside, which is on the battlefield, thanks to its ward ability, it's a better creature than Atraxa. Like, this is often going to be a 2-turn clock that if your opponent's going to deal with targeted removal, they have to have 3 non-land permanents to sack. So it's just a way to beat your opponent down. Valgavoth is actually much better than Atraxa. If you see Atraxa does die a lot, right? A lot of the times, someone plays Atraxa, they draw a bunch of cards, then the Atraxa dies, and they eventually do it again. But you don't really care because you generated so much card advantage. So I would say Valgavoth is like a tier below Atraxa in probably every format as a reanimation target. I still think it's very good though. And it might be better in older formats just thanks to the ward ability. Like in Legacy, let's say, if you reanimate this, sure, you're not going to draw a bunch of cards like you do with Atraxa, but that ward of sack 3 non-lands is going to be really hard for most decks to pay if you're doing this like on turn 1 or on turn 2, and maybe you can just beat your opponent down before they get a chance to actually kill it. Speaking of the ward, I've seen a lot of people freaking out about the ward because people just really dislike ward. In Ward of Sack 3 non-lands, it is legitimately one of the best wards that we've seen, but I will say, if you look at Standard, it is kind of matchup dependent. Like, if you play this against a traditional Drago control deck or something like Golgari mid-range, the ward is going to be absurd there. Like, if a Golgari deck wants to go for the throat this, they're probably going to have to sack 3 real permanents, not like random tokens or whatever. On the other hand, we got a lot of decks in Standard that are going wide with tokens, playing Caretaker's Talent, have a bunch of maps and clues and random stuff like that around. Those decks sacking 3 non-lands is actually like not that big of a deal. So I think the word's going to be very matchup dependent. It's going to be at its best against control style decks that are not Caretaker's Talent control decks, and also against mid-range decks. Going to be at its worst against token decks and go wide style decks, where you're going to be able to sack 3 things pretty easily to get this off the battlefield. I think in Standard, this is a good reanimation target, and it's definitely one of the most interesting and fun reanimation targets. Like, being able to reanimate this and then like mill your opponent or kill some of their stuff and then cast it for free seems really, really fun. And we do have some really good reanimation in Standard. We see that with Squirming Emergence and the Cruelty of Gix. So I certainly think there is a role for this card in Standard. Maybe not replacing Atraxa, but alongside Atraxa perhaps. Once you get back to Commander, I think there's a few different places this card can fit. So obviously, you can just play it as your commander, although I don't actually think it's that great as a commander. It's hard to cheat commanders into play. Like, you have to get Valgavoth from the command zone into like your hand and then to the graveyard if you want to reanimate it. Otherwise, you got to try to ramp into it. So I think it's better as like a 99 card, although it does seem really sweet with Shadowborn Apostle, where this is a really good demon to tutor up with your Shadowborn Apostles. It seems like a nice addition to reanimation decks like Sephiroth that can cheat it into play on the cheap. It also seems good in demon decks, especially like Rakdos Lord of Riots, which can ramp it into play with its ability. So those I think are the homes for the card. So Valgavoth, obviously a super strong creature, although it might get overshadowed a little bit by Atraxa in Standard, because Atraxa is just that busted. We also got a new Kaito in Kaito Bane of Nightmares. So Kaito Bane of Nightmares, our Planeswalker from the set, 4 mana, sort of. It actually has ninjutsu for 3, so it can be 3 mana if you can ninjutsu it into play. 4 loyalty, it says during your turn, as long as it has 1 or more loyalty counters on it, it's a 3/4 ninja creature with hexproof. So if you ninjutsu it, you get in 3 damage with it, and then you're able to activate its abilities. Its abilities, +1, make an emblem. With ninjas you control, get +1/+1. 0, surveil 2, then draw a card for each opponent that lost life this turn. -2, tap target creature, put 2 stun counters on it. So Kaito is an incredibly weird card. So obviously, it's a ninja card, right? Its emblem specifically pumps ninjas. If you think about what it does, Glorious Anthem for ninjas, Curate with its 0, I guess a Curate that scales for commander if you can hit multiple opponents for damage, and it's worth mentioning, if you're playing some sort of control deck, it's going to be worse. I imagine if you're playing Kaito, you're playing a bunch of creatures, trying to ninjutsu it into play, but if you don't have any creatures, your opponent's probably not going to lose life, so you're not going to draw the card. And then the last mode, I guess it's kind of Dream Do and Trancer. Like, it's okay removal. Like, being able to remove a creature for a couple turns is very nice. It's going to keep it from attacking Kaito, going to keep your life total high, although it is not hard removal either. So I think the thing about Kaito is, it feels very much like a ninja card, but we just lost Kamigawa from Standard at rotation, so right now there are 2 ninjas in Standard, Sator the Infiltrator and Cybia Cryptomancer, so we can't really build a ninja deck with Kaito. So right now its emblem is basically just pumping itself. We'll have to wait and see. Maybe this is a plant for the future, and we're going to be getting more ninjas. Once we get more ninjas, then the emblem becomes really, really strong. That plus emblem, if you can keep this out for a couple turns, your ninjas are going to get super, super huge super quickly. We just don't really have the pieces to build ninjas in Standard right now. Probably the best home short term is to play this in the Dimir mid-range, Dimir aggro style decks. Remember what Kaito Suzuki used to do, where like you're playing all these evasive creatures, Spyglass Siren, Fairy Mastermind, Deep Cavern Bat, then you get down your Kaito's drawing your cards each turn. I feel like this Kaito kind of does the same thing. Like, sure, you're not going to get that much value out of the +1 emblem for ninjas, but still, you're probably surveilling true and drawing a card each turn. You can tap something down if you need to. Plus, it's going to turn into a creature with hexproof that you can smash your opponent for some damage with. So I think in like the Dimir shell, it works really well because you have all these evasive creatures to ninjutsu into play and to make sure you're hitting that 0 ability by damaging your opponent to draw cards. Once you get back to older formats, then building a ninja deck is realistic, although honestly, I'm not sure I would rather play Kaito Bane of Nightmares over Kaito Suzuki in a ninja deck. Like, if I'm playing, I don't know, modern ninjas or timeless ninjas or something, is this actually better than Kaito Suzuki? Like, Kaito Suzuki has a plus of drawing a card, which is better than a 0, although you get the upside of being able to surveil with Kaito Bane and Nightmares. You also get to phase it out, which is pretty relevant. Like, I imagine there's going to be a lot of times where you ninjutsu Kaito into play, you get in some damage, you activate it once, and then your opponent just tacks it down. Kaito Suzuki phasing out is actually really, really huge there. So I'm not sure. How do you think these two cards compare? Like, really, in a ninja deck, they should both be 3-mana Planeswalkers, thanks to the ninjutsu thing. Curious which one you would play, because I actually kind of think Kaito Suzuki might still just be better there. So Kaito Bane and Nightmares, just a weird addition to Standard. The card is cool. I love ninjutsu on a Planeswalker. It's a really, really neat design. And huge shout out for Wizards, because one of the big criticisms that we used to have with Planeswalkers was they got very cookie cutter and boring. They're just kind of the same thing, you know, plus draw a card, minus remove something, emblem that wins the game. And Wizards has fixed that problem, maybe in part by making less Planeswalkers, but they've been doing an amazing job of printing really unique Planeswalkers lately, and Kaito is another one. This is a super unique, super cool design. I just don't know where it fits in Standard. Maybe it's a plan for the future. Maybe we're getting more ninjas. We have 3 years with this card in Standard, so I imagine sooner or later we're going to have a deck for it. Short term, I'm going to test it out in the Dimir mid-range decks, where I think maybe it synergizes well enough with those evasive creatures that it could be worth a couple of slots there. Next up, we got a new type of enchantment in room enchantments, as shown off by Dollmaker Shop / Porcelain Gallery. And this card is very, very interesting. So the way these cards work is they're enchantments. You can see they have 2 different cards. They're essentially enchantment split cards. So you can cast this card as Dollmaker Shop for 2 mana, and then you get an enchantment that says whenever 1 or more non-toy creatures you control attack a player, you can create a 1/1 white toy creature artifact token, or you can play it as Porcelain Gallery, which is 6 mana, and it says creatures you control have base power and toughness equal to the number of creatures you control. But what makes this card unique is you can play one side, and then while it's on the battlefield, you can pay the other side's mana cost to unlock that room, and then you'll have access to both of them. So how I imagine this will mostly play is you play it as Dollmaker Shop in the early game. You kind of get this Adeline, essentially. Any of your creatures is an Adeline. You get a 1/1 when you attack. So you start making some tokens, and then once you get up enough mana, you can open up Porcelain Gallery, make your team super huge with this sort of court of arms mode, essentially, that's going to pump your team really, really big based on how many creatures you have, and just kill your opponent in one shot. However, you could wait too. Like, there is some legitimacy. You're playing some sort of go wide deck. Maybe you intentionally don't run out Dollmaker Shop because your opponent's going to see Porcelain Gallery sitting there. Maybe you wait till you get up to 6 mana and you just cast this as like a weird coat of arms effect and try to one-shot your opponent with this huge buff to your creatures. So I gotta say, I love the design of these cards. It's kind of like class enchantments, but with the flexibility of MDFCs where you have 2 different cards you can play from your hand, kind of like past split cards. So I think it's really cool, and I love the design of them, just how this vertical layout really does make it look like a room, right? It looks like you're in Dollmaker Shop, and then you'll walk into Porcelain Gallery once you unlock it. So I think the flavor is really good, and I think the power is really good. Any mechanic that just offers additional cards, your cards are now 2 cards, are really powerful thanks to the flexibility. How good Dollmaker Shop in specific is, we'll have to wait and see. Like, the first mode, the Dollmaker Shop mode, does require you to have creatures on the battlefield. I do like that the token it makes is not tapped in attacking, so you can use it on defense. It's not just going to chump attack. And then the last mode does seem incredibly powerful, but that is board state dependent, right? If your opponent wraths you and you have 0 creatures, then Porcelain Gallery doesn't do anything at all. One other thing I want to mention about these cards, this is the only room enchantment we've seen so far, but one other thing I want to mention, because it came up on the stream yesterday, is what happens if you blink these cards or reanimate these cards. And Wizards actually clarified, let's say you play Dollmaker Shop and then you blink it, you're going to get a room enchantment with no rooms open. So then you'd have to pay 2 mana to unlock Dollmaker Shop or 6 mana for Porcelain Gallery. So it doesn't work especially well with like blinking or reanimation, anything like that, because you're still going to have to pay for the rooms, but still super cool design, and I think potentially a pretty powerful card. Speaking of white mythic enchantments, we got another good one in Overlord of the Mistmoors. So a 7 mana 6/6 Avatar Horror enchantment creature. It says when it enters or attacks, create 2 2/1 white insect creature tokens with flying, and then it has impending 4 for 4 mana. So what impending means is you can cast it for 4 mana, but it's not going to be a creature. It's going to be an enchantment. You'll still get its ETB though. So you cast it for 4 mana, you get 2/2/1 white flying insect creature tokens, and then you're also going to have 4 time counters on it. At the beginning of your end step, you remove a time counter from it, and then once you remove the last time counter, then it turns into a creature and you can start attacking with it. So it essentially gives you some flexibility. So if you think about what this card is, it's essentially a Talrand's Invocation, where almost a Talrand's Invocation. I guess Talrand's Invocation gave you 2/2/2s with flying. This gives you 2/2/1s with flying, but 4 mana make 2/2-powered flying creatures, and then it's kind of like a Grave Titan essentially. If you get up to 7 mana, you cast this, you get a 6/6, it's going to make 2/2/1 flyers, and then when it attacks, you make more 2/1 flyers, and there's a lot of sneaky synergies here. So I think Overlord of the Mistmoors might just be a really good card. It works really well with Caretaker's Talent, which we've seen take off, is one of the dominant forces in Standard. You get Caretaker's Talent on 3, on 4, you can impending your Overlord of the Mistmoors, make some tokens, draw some cards, and then maybe like Wrath the Board or something, and eventually you're going to remove the time counters and get this Overlord of the Mistmoors as a creature. So it seems to fit really well into the Caretaker's Talent decks. We'll have to see. They also play Biza in the 4-drop slot, so we'll have to see what the exact mix is, but it does synergize super well there. As I mentioned before, it works well in Control too, because you can impending this, get it on the battlefield as an enchantment, make a couple of flyers to deal some damage or chump block, then you can Wrath, but you're not going to Wrath away the enchantment, and then eventually your enchantment becomes a creature and you start beating down post Wrath. So a lot of synergy there as well. It also does work really well with blink style effects. There's not a ton of ways to blink enchantments in Standard, but we do have Unyielding Gatekeeper, we do have Scroll Shift. So what you can do here is cast your Overlord of the Mistmoors as an impending creature to get the flyers, and then blink it. It'll come back as a creature, it'll enter, it'll make more flyers, and then you have this huge 6/6 that's going to attack and make even more flyers. So it works really well in blink style decks. I heard some people mentioning Solemnity. There's another way to build around this, and I gotta say, I don't believe that this works. So Solemnity would just make it so your Overlord of the Mistmoors wouldn't have any counters on it. So people were thinking, oh, if I play Solemnity, then I can Overlord impending, but it's just gonna be creature mode. But my understanding is, and we gotta wait till we get the full rules update for Duskmourn, but the way the reminder text works, and what they said in the article about it, is that impending triggers when the last time counter is removed. So I imagine if you don't have any time counters on it, you never remove the last one, so it never becomes a creature. But we'll have to wait until we see the rules update. But I feel like Overlord of the Mistmoors, it is expensive, but the impending helps reduce the cost, and it just works so well with some of the best cards in Standard that I think we'll be seeing a lot of this card. The fact that it can be a 4-drop or a 7-drop, it works with Caretaker's Talent, it works with Wrath, makes it seem like a really, really powerful creature. We also got a mythic green 3-drop in Hauntwoods Shrieker, which shows off a new returning mechanic. So Hauntwoods Shrieker, 3 mana green 3/3. It says whenever it attacks, manifest dread. So if you don't remember manifest is putting the top card of your library onto the battlefield as a 2/2 face down creature, and then if it's a creature you can flip it up for its mana cost. Manifest dread is the same thing, except you go 1 card deeper. So you'll look at your top 2 cards of your library, choose one of them to put on the battlefield as a face down creature, and then you can flip it up, blah 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 blah. The other ability on Hauntwoods Shrieker is pay 1 and a green, reveal target face down permanent. If it's a creature card, you can turn it face up. So Hauntwoods Shrieker, I'm not sure what to make of this card. So Manifest Dread, Wizards loves their tweaks on these face down mechanics. It's essentially Mega Manifest. I know. But now we have like 3 different face down mechanics in Standard. So it's kind of like a Cloud Form style effect. This card can snowball, right? If you can get this going and keep attacking with it, it's a 3 mana 3/3 that's making a 2/2 every turn, and then you get the upside of maybe flipping that thing up. It also does work with our other face down mechanics. So maybe you're playing Hauntwoods Shrieker with Cryptic Co, and you use Cryptic Co to cloak something that you really want to flip face up. You can use Hauntwoods Shrieker to flip it face up at a discount, or really as Vindicator, you can flip it up. So there's synergies with Disguise and with Cloak, so that's kind of a neat thing. The problem I have with this card is I'm just not convinced that a 3 mana 3/3 is going to be good enough. If you look at the green 3-drops we have in Standard, Sentinels of the Nameless City, it's a 3/4, Bloated Contaminator, 4/4, Pelucranos, 4/5, Scrap Shooter, 4/4, and then once you get down to 3/3s, you get cards that have a ton of flexibility, like Tranquil Throwback, they can get graveyards and gain life and just kind of this catch-all Swiss Army knife. So I'm a little worried that Hauntwoods Shrieker might just be too far below the curve for a green deck. I know it's like a cool design, and I like the flipping stuff face-up aspect, and I love how it synergizes with Murder Zakarlov Manor, getting some more interset synergy going, but I think as a 3-3, it might just not have a good enough body to actually compete with the other threats. Maybe this changes once we get Llanowar Elves and Foundations. Playing this on turn 2 is pretty scary. Like, play it on turn 2, attack on turn 3, make a free 2/2. The other trick you can do with this card, if you have enough mana, you can attack with it. And remember, it's Manifest Dread triggers on attack, not combat damage. So you can attack with it. Maybe it's a bad attack, it's going to die in damage, but you can attack and manifest something. And then, if you manifest something big, you can pay 2, flip it face up. Sure, your Hauntwoods Shrieker is going to die, but if you flip something massive into play, you don't really care, right? It already did its job. So we're going to have to see how it shakes out. I am excited to play this in one specific deck. We played this deck a while ago that was looking to use Vannifar and Unyielding Gatekeeper and Hide in Plain Sight is this weird disguise cloak plan and trying to get like Atraxas and Portal to Phyrexias into play at these massive threats and then flip them face up by using like Atratas or Unyielding Gatekeepers. I think Hauntwoods Shrieker would work really well in a shell like that. That's probably my favorite home, is some sort of like surprise deck where you're trying to just use it to manifest something huge and for 2 mana flip that huge thing face up. But as just a generic green threat, I think its body might not quite be good enough to actually make the cut in standard. I wish it was a 3/4, maybe a 4/4, honestly, maybe it'd be too strong at that point. So we'll have to wait and see. The card seems powerful. Manifesting every turn is a powerful effect. I just worry that its stats might not be big enough. Speaking of green mythic 3/3s for 3, somehow we got another one in Tyvar the Pummeler. So Tyvar the Pummeler, 3 mana for a 3/3. It's a legendary elf warrior. It says tap another untapped creature you control. It gains indestructible until end of turn. Tap it. Worth mentioning, you can swing with this into combat and then tap something, and it'll already be tapped because it's attacking, so you kind of get around the tap it to make it indestructible. And then you can pay 5 creatures you control, get +X until end of turn, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So a nice creature boost, although it is worth mentioning, no evasion. There's no trample there or anything. So Tyvar, it, to me, suffers from the same issue as Hauntwoods Shrieker, which is, I'm just not sure a 3 mana 3/3, even with some upsides, is good enough just based on its rate alone. Like, is its stats good enough? I do like you can make it indestructible. That's a nice upside if you're not getting hit by Sunfall or some sort of exile-based removal spell. And then its 5 mana activation can just close out the game. If you can make a big board, it can just straight up kill people, even without trample. It's kind of like Overwhelming Splendor. It's actually like literally Overwhelming Splendor, except there's no trample on it, which is a little bit sketchy. Like, let's say Tyvar should be its creature. You're gonna give everything +3/+3, which is nice, but your opponent can still do some chump blocking, so I think it's a powerful effect in like an elf deck or a go wide green deck, but I do kind of think it would be better, obviously, if it gave trample like Overwhelming Splendor. I think in Commander, to me, this just feels like bad Azuri. Like, if I'm paying 5 mana, I think I'd rather just have +3/+3 in trample than plus whatever, but no trample. So I think this is a card that I'm actually kind of skeptical of. We'll have to see. Like, green hasn't been that good in standard. Again, gonna get better once we have Llanowar Elves. I think I would jam this in the 99 of other elf decks is just like a backup way to boost my team, but I'm not sure I'd play this as my commander. I think if I'm playing a mono green elf deck, I'm probably going Azuri as my commander. And then Morrowind also like does cool things by just making tons of mana. But if I'm playing an Azuri deck or a Voja deck or a Lathril deck or a Morrowind deck, I think this is a fine card in the 99. Like, elves are really good at going wide, and one of the ways to get around the drawback of its pumping ability not giving trample is just go so wide that it doesn't matter. If you just make a huge board and then pump all your team +5/+5 or something, you're probably going to kill people just by going around their blockers rather than going over the top of them with trample. So we'll have to wait and see. Again, I'm a little skeptical that a 3 mana 3/3 is going to be enough, but it is a powerful elf card, and I do think maybe we can make elves work in standard. We played a Voja elves deck a while ago, and the elves were pretty janky. The more good elves we get, and seeing Tyvar and some of the other cards we've gotten recently makes me think maybe we can actually make a standard elf deck. If so, Tyvar would definitely be a part of it. Maybe like a 2 of, I would say, since it's legendary, but it is a sweet option to close out the game by buffing the team. We also got a new Zimone in Zimone All-Questioning. So I say that mass for blockers, but apparently that is no longer true. It's a 3-mana 1/1 legendary human wizard, and it says at the beginning of your end step, if a land entered the battlefield under your control this turn, and you control a prime number of lands, create Primo, the Indivisible, a legendary 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token, then put that many +1/+1 counters on it. So they were nice enough to remind us that prime numbers, at least the first prime numbers, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23, 29, and 31, plus obviously there's way more prime numbers. Gonna be hard to get enough lands to trigger above 31, I think, but still, this is a very interesting card. So at a base level, Zimone on turn 3 is essentially like a weird Blade Splicer or a Sandstorm Salvager. You play your land drop, you play this on turn 3, you go to your end step, you get a 3/3 Primo. The upside is, if your Primo dies and you get up to 5 lands and you still have Zimone, then you're going to get a 5/5 Primo. Or even if your Primo doesn't die, you can still just Legend Roll and make a bigger version of Primo. And then you can do it again at 7 or 11 if you get there. So it's kind of like a Blade Splicer that has some downsides. Like on turn 4, this is going to be awkward because you're not going to have a prime number worth of land, so it's not going to do anything right away. But if you can consistently have this be a 1/1 that makes a 3/3, and then you get the upside of replacing that 3/3 with a bigger creature later in the game, that might be close enough for this card to see some play. I think this card, most likely though, gonna be a fun build around Commander. I don't think this one's really designed for Standard. I think this is kind of a cool challenge build around Commander, and the challenge is essentially, how big of a fractal can I make? What is the biggest prime number I can possibly get to? What is the biggest Primo I can make in my Commander deck? And it does work really well with some certain green cards. So obviously, if you're playing a Simic deck, you're gonna have all kinds of land ramps. So you're gonna have all your Farseeks and your Nature's Lures and your Open the Ways. So it's pretty easy to manipulate the amount of lands you control, and these are all cards that you're gonna want in your deck anyway. The other thing I really like with the Zimone and Commander is sack to draw card draw effects, like Greater Good, Momentous Fall, Life's Legacy, seem like a really, really good way to take advantage of Primo. So you like make a 3/3 Primo, and you can sack it to Greater Good to do some filtering, but then you make a 5/5 Primo, and you sack it to Life's Legacy to draw 5 cards, and that's going to find you more ramp, it's going to find you more lands to get on the battlefield. Then you make a 7/7 Primo and sack that to Greater Good, then you get up to 11 lands to do it again. So it seems really, really good with the draw based on creatures' power sacrifice effects, plus you could do it with like Rishkar's Expertise and so forth, but the nice thing is, the Primo's legendary anyway, right? So you might as well sack it to Greater Good, because you're going to be making a bigger Primo, hopefully by the end of the turn anyway. So I think it actually seems like a fun challenge. The only thing I'll say is while the design is super interesting, I actually think this is going to play much more boring than people think in Commander. Like, it's a super cool way to word this card. It's like, prime numbers matter, something we've never seen before. But when it comes down to it, all Zimone really wants you to do is play the good green cards. Like, play all the land ramp effects, play the good green card draw to take advantage of Primo. So in the end, it's a Commander where all it really wants you to do is play all the green staples, and it's going to do its thing. It's just worded in such a unique way that I think it's going to be a fairly popular build around. So not expecting a ton from Zimone in Standard. Maybe the Blade Splicer mode will be enough to let it see a little bit of play. It doesn't work very well with blinking effects, which is the easiest way to take advantage of like a Blade Splicer, because you're getting the token on your end step rather than as an ETB trigger, so blinking doesn't really do anything. But in Commander, I expect we're going to see some pretty mathy decks build around this card, and it does seem super fun. So when I was watching the stream yesterday, one of my big worries was, who's going to die in this set, right? This is themed after horror movies. If you ever watch a horror movie, pretty much everyone dies. Usually there's like one person that survives, and everyone in Twitch chat was like, they're not going to kill anyone. They can't kill anyone. They don't want to kill off Tyvars and Zimones and these characters. But then they showed off Winter Misanthropic Guide, and as soon as I saw this card, I was like, that's the person that's going to die. That's the one, and I'm pretty sure that's how this story is going to end up. So Winter, the card design, actually super cool. It's a 4-mana Jund 3/4 legendary human warlock. It has Ward of 2. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, each player draws 2 cards, and then it has Delirium. If there's 4 more card types among cards in your graveyard, each opponent's max hand size is equal to 7 minus the number of those card types. So that last ability, how this actually works, let's say you have base Delirium, 4 card types. Your opponent's max hand size is going to be 7 minus 4, which is 3. So your opponent on their end step, gonna have to discard down to 3 cards. But it gets even better than that. If you can get 7 card types in your graveyard, your opponent's max hand size will be 7 minus 7, which is 0, which means you can turn this into a 4-mana Jin Gataxias. It's gonna take some work. You're gonna have to really stock your graveyard with card types, but that does seem pretty hilarious. So this can just come down and wipe out everyone's hands. It is a drawback, I think, that you're making your opponents draw cards. That makes me a little skeptical that this will work in Standard. I imagine a lot of times you like play this and then your opponent's gonna draw those cards and they can use those cards to kill the winter, which makes you kind of sad, but it can do hilarious things once it gets going. So the fun of Mythos, everyone draws 2 every turn cycle. Ugh, that makes me question its uses in Standard. Although, like I said, the max hand side reduction of potentially making a 4-mana Jin Gataxias is kind of hilarious. If this card is going to work in Standard, I imagine it's going to be in a discard deck. I think a discard deck is the best way to reduce the downside of having each player draw 2 cards on your upkeep. So one of the things about discard decks are, once you empty your opponent's hand, a lot of your cards stop doing anything because you're drawing more discard, but your opponent doesn't have anything to discard. If you have Winter in your discard deck, your opponent's going to draw 2 cards on your upkeep, but then in theory you just use your Bandit's Talents and Liliana's to make your opponent discard the cards, plus you're going to be getting 2 cards as well. So I think maybe there's like some Jun discard deck that could take advantage of Winter. I'm definitely going to try to build it because it seems like it'd be super hilarious. The other way to do this is just go full on Jin Gataxias. Just like, my goal is to self-mill with a bunch of card types as quickly as possible. Try to like duress or bat or something to make sure your opponent doesn't have a removal spell for Winter. Stick Winter and trust on my opponent's end step, they're going to discard their entire hand. And once you do that, you should be able to ride it to victory, right? Once your opponent's entire hand has been mind twisted, you should be able to figure out a way to win the game somehow. In Commander, I guess this would be like a wheel commander is probably the easiest way to think of it, since it's making your opponent draw extra cards. If you're playing Underworld Dreams and Sheoldreds and so forth, you can get damage out of forcing your opponents to draw cards, throw them some wheel effects. But really, I think this card is probably going to be pretty hated in Commander. I think this might be... I'm actually curious what you think of this one. Is this a, like, okay to play commander, or is this going to be like a Turgid style commander, where, yes, you can play it, but people are going to be pretty salty? One thing I know about commander players is they don't really like discarding their hand. Jin Gataxias is like a super salty card, and this can be, if you build around it, like 4-mana Jin Gataxias from the command zone, so you don't even have to draw it. So I think that Winter might actually just be a really salty commander, but it is a really, really cool design. We've never seen a card like this, and again, I gotta give Wizards credit here. This is a super unique legend. We haven't seen a legend that does what Winter does before. It's not just some cookie cutter, do the same thing as everything else card. So I really like the uniqueness of it, although I do worry a little bit that it's just going to be super salty. Not only can a Jin Gataxias away the hand, but Ward already just makes Commander players see red. Commander players just hate the Ward mechanic, so you know there's going to be some salty stories of people like losing their hand to Winter because they couldn't pay 2 for the Ward and just absolutely hating the card. But I think it looks pretty hilarious. Next up, we got 2 more enduring creatures, and I absolutely love this cycle. One of my big problems with a lot of past enchantment creatures is they don't really feel like enchantments to me. A lot of them, you could remove enchantment from them altogether and it would be perfectly fine. But the enduring creatures actually feel like enchantments because they're creatures that once they die come back as enchantments and have enchantment-y abilities. So first off, we have Enduring Curiosity, a 4-mana 4/3 flash enchantment creature Glimmer, and it says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, and then when it dies, if it was a creature, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control as an enchantment. So essentially, Enduring Curiosity, it's a coastal piracy, but you get a flash 4/3 creature first, and then once it dies, it just becomes a literal coastal piracy. And I think this card's pretty strong. We've seen like Toski be very strong. Toski, much smaller, but it's indestructible and can't be countered. Enduring Curiosity gets upside of flash in a bigger body, plus the card advantage it can generate is really, really good. So in Commander, I think this card has potential to be a staple. In any sort of go wide deck, being able to just flash this in, refill your hand, and then if it dies, you get an enchantment, so you get another shot at the next turn, is going to be worth it. So if you're playing a Marinus Calgar or Adrix and Nev, Felix 5 Boost, Rigo, any sort of go wide deck in blue, I'm playing this card in the deck. I think it might be the new best version of the Coastal Piracy effect. Well, actually, Toski might still be the best version, but the new best blue version of the effect, Flash is a really, really huge upside. Your opponents aren't going to see that first attack coming, and then being able to turn into an enchantment eventually makes it really, really strong. So I think a commander staple for sure. In Standard, that's where it's more interesting. My first instinct was probably not a great Standard card, but then, if you think about it, we have Gix in Standard, and Gix is kind of a Standard staple. I know it's one less mana, but you gotta take damage if you want to draw the cards. This has Flash, so you can sneak it in around counter spells better. So I think this might actually have Standard potential. You could play this in the same decks as Gix, like the Dimir mid-range style decks, and you just draw a bunch of cards off your Bats and your Sirens and so forth. The other place this is interesting to me is in mono blue control. So in the past, we've had like Curious Obsession decks, where the idea is you play a blue threat, you put a Curious Obsession on it, so you can draw a card every time it attacks, and just try to counter everything your opponent does until you win the game. Having Flash on this makes me think maybe you could play this in like a Eddie Merc Crab deck. So the Gix deck, you're trying to go super wide and draw a ton of cards with this, but in the Eddie Merc Crab style mono blue deck, maybe you're just drawing 1 or 2 extra cards a turn, and you're just flashing this in on your opponent's end step, attacking with 1 or 2 creatures to draw 1 or 2 cards, leaving up your mana to counter things. It's not even legendary, so you can stack up multiples of these to draw an absurd number of cards. So I think this card actually has more Standard potential than I gave it credit for at first. I think this card might actually be very good in Standard. Its stats are fine, Flash is huge, being resilient to the first removal spell is huge, so I think this card could have multiple homes in Standard. It might actually be pretty powerful. Speaking of really good Standard cards, we also got Enduring Innocence. So this is the white Enduring creature. It's a 3-mana 2/1 lifelinking Sheep Glimmer. It says whenever 1 or more other creatures you control with power 2 or less enter, draw a card. This ability only triggers once each turn, and then when it dies, it comes back into play as an enchantment. So this is essentially Welcoming Vampire, but it's Welcoming Vampire, I guess, on a worse body, right? It's a 2/1 ground creature, although lifelink is nice, but you get the upside that once it dies, it comes back as an enchantment, which is kind of huge, and then once it's an enchantment, future copies are going to be triggering it because it's a 2-power creature. So in a weenie style deck, this seems really good. We saw Welcoming Vampire, despite the once per turn restriction, be a very good card in Standard. Also in Commander, if you're playing a weenie Commander deck, you're going to play this in there too, but maybe some sort of like Warden of the Inner Sky deck. We have these Convoke decks that are very good at just playing cheap creatures every turn. This is a steady source of card advantage. I don't know if you main deck it, it might be too slow for the main. Worst case, it seems like a good sideboard card you can bring in those grinding matchups. Maybe the Bat deck, I know Zoraline itself doesn't trigger it, but most of the other bats do. Monastery Mentor is making tokens, and that's one of the tricks for this card. Remember, it triggers once each turn, so if you can have a creature with power 2 or less enter during your opponent's turn, maybe because you have Monastery Mentor, or maybe you're flashing in a Resolute Reinforcements, or using the adventure mode of Virtue of Loyalty, you can be doubling up your card draw. So I think this card definitely has homes in Standard for sure, and it's a good Commander card. We've seen the Welcoming Vampire style effects in decks that are just playing a bunch of white weenie style creatures be a really good source of card advantage, and again, this is one of the best versions of this effect. Imagine your Welcoming Vampire coming back as an enchantment once it dies. That's what Enduring Innocence gives you. We also got an incredibly interesting new pseudo Wrath in Split Up. So Split Up, 3-mana white sorcery. It says choose one, destroy all tap creatures, or destroy all untapped creatures. So this is incredibly cheap for a Wrath effect, although the fact that it only gets tapped or untapped creatures means it's not often going to be a full Wrath. You're probably not going to kill everything with this card, but not killing everything can actually be a big upside, because I think the challenge of this card is going to be trying to break its symmetry. So if you think about what this card is, we've never really seen anything like it. We have destroy all tap creature effects, but those mostly start at like 5 mana, like don't move. So this is super cheap even for just destroy all tap creatures. And then destroy all untapped creatures, we've honestly just never had a Wrath that does that before. Season of the Witch, I guess, was the closest I could come up with, although it's not a very good comparison, although the art is super creepy, so it's a good flavor comparison. So Split Up, how does this fit in Standard? I don't think it's a Sunfall, because it's not just going to get rid of everything. It's more like a temporary lockdown, but with a lot of upside. I don't know if it's as good as Sunfall or temporary lockdown in just a generic deck. Those cards are very easy to play in just like a generic control deck. You can throw them in, they're going to be good. Split Up, I think, is a Wrath that has a ton of play to it. It's a Wrath that's actually skill testing, which I think is really cool, because Wraths are kind of brain dead cards. You're just like, meh, 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 cast them, all the creatures are gone. Split Up, on the other hand, has a lot going on with it. So first, against aggro, this is often just going to be a temporary lockdown. If you're a control deck, your opponent's an aggro deck, they're probably going to be attacking with all their creatures each turn. So 3 mana, destroy all tap creatures, you're probably getting your opponent's entire board. Maybe you get unlucky and miss one that they played and was summoning sick and couldn't attack with, but this is often going to blow up all your aggro opponent's creatures for just 3 mana, which is pretty sweet. It also is something that you can try to synergize with and turn it into a Plague Wind. I think that's the real power of this card. Maybe you're playing a deck that's got a bunch of evasive creatures, Deep Cavern Bats and Dusk Animist and Preacher of the Schism, hard to block because of Death Touch. So you're playing a deck that's really good at getting your own creatures tapped. You can swing out with your team, get all your creatures tapped, and then split up on untapped creatures to hopefully blow up most or all of your opponent's board, especially if your opponent's like trying to play defense. This seems like a really, really good way to get them there too. So you can build this into almost a 3 mana Plague Wind in some scenarios. It also synergizes super well with Saddle and Crew. Saddle and Crew let you tap your creatures without attacking with them, so you can use Fortune or Subterranean Schooner to just tap down your entire team and then go untap creatures, blow up all your opponent's stuff. So there's so many synergies for this card. This is a Wrath that I could almost see playing in the Convoke decks. Like, the Convoke decks can do the same trick as Vehicles or Saddle, where you like use your Night Errant of Aos or maybe the Wandering Rescuer to tap down your team, and then you blow up all the untapped creatures and kill all of your opponent's stuff. Yeah, maybe you lose a thing, but you get to keep basically your whole board, so you're set up to Alpha Strike your opponent the following turn. So I think this card certainly has purposes. I'm not convinced that it like replaces Sunfall or Temporary Lockdown. We also know we have Day of Judgment coming in a couple of months in Foundations, but I think this is certainly a part of the Wrath Suite in Standard, and there's going to be some decks where this card is a legit bomb. The flexibility of this card is super, super huge. I will say, I'm not sure how excited I am for it in Commander. I think the same thing basically applies in Commander, that I would not just replace my full Wraths with this, but instead I'd be building my deck in a way to try to break this symmetry. If I can make this so I'm mostly not losing any of my creatures and mostly blowing up all my opponent's creatures, that's where this card is really, really going to shine. So this card, very excited for. We've just never seen a Wrath like this before, and I love how much play there is to it. I love how much thought goes into it, how much you can actually build around it, which is something you just normally can't do with Wraths. So I think it's a really, really interesting design, and I'm honestly a little bit surprised at how cheap it is. At 3 mana, this card is very, very pushed. We also got a new demonic tutor, or maybe a demonic tutor, in Demonic Counsel. So 2 mana sorcery, search your library for a demon card, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. So a demonic tutor, you tutor for a demon, or if you have delirium, you get to search for any card. So then it's a demonic tutor. So Demonic Counsel, this card's pretty interesting. We have some pretty good demons in Standard. So its first non-delirium mode, I think could have some uses. We obviously just got Valgavoth, which is really, really big, but we also have like Bloodletter of Aklazotz that has combo potential. Hidetsugu and Kiri has combo potential. Obnixilis Captive Kingpin has combo potential. Bringer the Last Gift. So even if you're just using this to tutor up a demon, in the right deck, it could be worth it. And then of course, once you turn on Delirium, you get a literal demonic tutor, and demonic tutor is the best tutor of all time. This card is like so incredibly pushed. They would never actually print demonic tutor in Standard. The thing is, it does take some work to turn on delirium. That's one thing we've learned from some past tutors like Traverse Uvenwald or Mausoleum Secrets. When they first spoiled Traverse Uvenwald, I kind of thought, I'm just gonna have delirium naturally, right? I can just play this, and naturally as a game of Magic goes along, stuff's gonna end up in the graveyard. I'll turn on delirium, I'll be able to turn it into a full tutor. In practice though, that doesn't really happen. You actually do have to build around delirium to some extent. So I don't think you can just jam this in a random Standard deck and trust that you're gonna turn on delirium and make it good. However, if you're a deck that's willing to put some work into self-milling and playing different card types, then you're rewarded with a literal demonic tutor in Standard. So I think this card actually has a decent amount of potential. In Commander, I think it's obvious home is going to be demon decks. Like, if you're playing Bellicor or Rakdos or Raphael, then I think Demonic Counsel is just going to be one of the best tutors in your deck. You're able to get whatever demon you need, and then eventually maybe you do turn it on. It also seems very good in self-mill style decks. If you're playing Madraltha or Murko or Sidisi, where you're filling your graveyard, Madraltha even wants you to play different permanent types, you're going to turn this into a demonic tutor eventually. So I think this card definitely has uses in standard where it can tutor up demons for combos, or in graveyard decks where it's eventually going to tutor up everything, and in commander. Next up, we have one of my favorite creepy pieces of Magic art that I think has ever been made in the Jolly Balloon Man, who is blowing up some faces. So it is a 3-mana 1/4 hasty human clown. It's a legendary creature, and then you can tap it to create a token that's a copy of another target creature you control, except it's a 1/1 red balloon creature in addition to its other colors and types, and it has flying and haste, and then you gotta sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step, and you can only activate it as a sorcery. So the Jolly Balloon Man, this card is essentially the backside of Fable the Mirror Breaker. Very, very close to the backside, which is Reflections of Kiki-Jiki. You get a little bit more toughness. It has haste. The biggest difference is you can use the Jolly Balloon Man to copy legendary creatures if you want to, which you can't do with Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, which does offer some upside in standard, making like a 1/1 red balloon a Troxa or a 1/1 red balloon a Tally. And this card just seems super fun to play with. I love copying stuff. Obviously, because you're making a 1/1 version of the effect, a 1/1 red balloon version of the effect, you're going to want to copy things with powerful ETB triggers or combat damage triggers. You're not going to get in a ton of damage. That's the other big difference between this and Reflections of Kiki-Jiki. With Reflections, if you copy some 8/8, you're going to get an 8/8 and deal a ton of damage. The Jolly Balloon Man always going to be making 1/1s, but still imagine like Jolly Balloon Man copy a Troxa, draw a bunch more cards. Jolly Balloon Man copy a Tally, cast a bunch more cards for free. Seems very, very strong. There's also a lot of synergies for it in standard. We've talked about this a bunch, but there's a lot of token synergies. We got Caretaker's talent. Gyrid is actually kind of hilarious with this. Gyrid makes it so your non-token creatures can tap to create a token that's a copy of target token that entered the battlefield this turn. There might be a way to use this synergy to make 99 red balloons, maybe. I'm just saying, which is one of the biggest challenges of this card, I think, is trying to be the first person to make 99 red balloons in Magic. But there are a lot of synergies for the tokens in standard. The other place that this works really well is with creatures that have powerful combat damage triggers, but are not easy to get in combat damage with. So like Archmage's Newt, for example, if you can saddle it and get in combat damage with it, you can cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard for free, which is incredibly strong. The problem is, it is not easy to get in with a Grizzly Bear, a 2/2 ground creature, but with a Jolly Balloon Man, you can make a 1/1 flying hasty copy of Archmage's New, and then you get in the combat damage, cast your thing for free, hopefully win the game. Same with like Archpriest of Shadows, anything that is like a ground creature that's blockable, but does something really powerful when it gets in for combat damage. The Jolly Balloon Man works really, really well there as well. There's also some combo potential, not like easy Kiki-Jiki style combo potential, but still like, let's say you have Jolly Balloon Man, and then you have Village Bell Ringers. Village Bell Ringers, when it enters, you get to untap all your creatures, and then you need a way to make mana, like a Delighted Halfling. So you can like play the Jolly Balloon Man, you copy the Village Bell Ringers. The Village Bell Ringer, it's going to untap Jolly Balloon Man, going to untap the Delighted Halfling, so you can use the mana from Halfling to activate Jolly Balloon Man again, copy the Village Bell Ringers, untap everything, do it again. So essentially 3-card combos rather than 2-card combos with Kiki-Jiki, but still something that you can pull off. If you want to do it in Commander, you can't use Delighted Halfling because of color identity, but you could replace it with like Mana Echoes. You just need a way to keep making a mana in one way or another from your creatures untapping or creatures entering the battlefield. So I think that's another direction you could go, but really, I just want to use this card for value. I just want to make a bunch of balloons, copy things with ETB triggers, maybe have a Panharmonicon out, and trust that all the balloons will eventually add up to the win. We also got a red 2-drop in Razorkin Needlehead, a 2 mana 2/2, Human Assassin. It's a red card. It has first strike during your turn, and then it says whenever opponent draws a card, Razorkin Needlehead deals 1 damage to them. Also, super creepy showcase art that reminds me of the movie Would You Rather, I think? So Razorkin Needlehead, it's essentially the cheapest Underworld Dreams we've ever had. Just your opponents take a damage whenever they draw a card. It doesn't even exclude the first card drawn each turn. So I think this is kind of like standard Orcish Bowmasters, a fixed Orcish Bowmasters. Honestly, one thing Krim always talks about in Commander is just wanting more Orcish Bowmasters to punish people for drawing tons of cards. Well, Razorkin Needlehead is not nearly as powerful because you're not making this massive orc to go along with it. If you just want to stack people from drawing cards, this is a pretty good way to do it. It doesn't hurt you at all. So I think this does have some ramifications as card draw hate. Could be good in some sort of wheel deck. That was kind of my first thought. In Standard even, we're talking about Winter making each player draw 2 cards during your upkeep. Maybe you got Razorkin Needlehead, and maybe you got a Shieldred. So as your opponent's drawing those cards, they're actually taking a ton of damage. Like one turn with Winter, with a Razorkin and a Shieldred, your opponent's going to take 6 damage, which is a lot. That's a big chunk of their life total. Plus, you can do the same thing in wheel-based commander decks. I think this could also be a mono-red threat. I'm actually not sure where this is going to end up in mono-red. So right now, the big mono-red 2-drops, you got Charming Scoundrel, you got Feldon, you got Fugitive Codebreaker. They all have haste. Razorkin Needlehead does not have haste, which is a big drawback. However, it is essentially guaranteed to get in at least 1 damage for free every turn it sits on the battlefield. And then if your opponent starts drawing extra cards, it can't be getting in even more damage. So it could have a role there. It's also an assassin, so maybe you're playing a crime deck or an outlaw deck and you have some synergies for being assassins. That's another upside. As I mentioned in Commander, you could just play this in any deck. If you're a Crim and you just really hate your opponents drawing cards, you could just play this to punish people for drawing cards. Like, your opponent's Seagate Restorations and Brainstorm is going to be pretty bad with this on the battlefield, but I imagine its main home in Commander probably going to be wheel decks that are intentionally doing Nekuzar, Xyrus, Locust God stuff, where as you're having your wheels be cast and making everyone discard their hand and draw a bunch of cards, Razorkin Needlehead is just going to deal a ton of damage. So it seems like an easy inclusion there. So Needlehead, I love drawing cards, but I actually like this design. I'm sure I'm going to lose to it on occasion, but I think it's a fair thing to punish, especially in Commander in 2024, when it's just so easy to generate these huge piles of card advantage. I think having more ways to punish it is a good thing, and I like that it's not as strong as Bowmasters. I think Bowmasters is well intended in what it's trying to do. It's just like too good at what it's trying to do. I think this is a pretty fair power level as a card that you can play to punish people for drawing cards in Commander, but isn't going to just absolutely dominate the game. We also got Peer Past the Veil, which my guess is this ends up a bulk rare, but we'll see. It's a 4-mana Gruul instant. It says discard your hand, then draw X cards, where X is the number of card types among cards in your graveyard. So essentially, I think this is designed to be a Delirium Enabler and a Delirium Payoff. So you can cast this to get cards into your graveyard, and then hopefully draw a bunch of new cards. The real question is going to be how many card types can you get in your graveyard, and how quickly can you empty your hand? Like, if you can empty your hand quickly, get a bunch of cards types in your graveyard, this could be a nice way to refuel. But if you're discarding 3 or 4 cards and drawing 3 or 4 cards, you're not really making much progress there. So all this to say, I think Peer Past the Veil has potential to be powerful. You're just going to need a very specific deck. I don't think there's a deck that exists in current Standard that I would just slot Peer Past the Veil into, but I could certainly see building a deck where Peer Past the Veil is like a key card advantage spell that could be incredibly powerful. We also got a very interesting new rare land in Valgavoth's Lair. So it is a enchantment land, our first ever true enchantment land, I'd say. It enters tapped, and as it enters, you get to choose a color and you make a mana of that color, and it has hexproof. So why is Valgavoth's Lair interesting? Well, as I mentioned before, outside of Urza's Saga, which I don't know if it even really counts, like no one plays Urza's Saga as a land. It's kind of like this weird artifact payoff that just happens to sort of be a land for a couple of turns. But this is our first ever enchantment land, and why does that matter? So there's certain synergies for enchantment. So one is constellation effects. We got like Calyx in Standard. Calyx can copy enchantments, and when an enchantment enters, you get to put a counter on something. So this is a land that'll trigger your Calyx. We also know that we're getting a new take on constellation in the set itself, in Eerie. So Eerie is literally Constellation, triggers whenever enchantment enters, but it also triggers when you unlock a room. So it's essentially Constellation with a little tiny bit of upside with rooms in specific. But I think Valgavoth's Lair, really important for effects like that. Having a land that can trigger all your Constellation and Eerie stuff seems very, very powerful. Once you get back to Commander or older formats, there's even more synergies. This is a land that is upping your enchantment count for Serra Sanctum or Sanctum Weaver. Super strong. Like Sanctum Weaver plus Valgavoth's Lair, you've already built an Ancient Tomb, right? Because your Sanctum Weaver is tapping for +1 mana, and you have a land that taps for mana. Plus you have Eidolon of Blossoms, that's Constellation, draw a card, your land drop is drawing you a card, or Rite of Harmony. You can even tutor it up with Enlightened Tutor if you really need to. So I think even though coming to play tapped and only making one color is a downside, I think in certain enchantment decks, there's enough synergies here that Lair could be very, very good in those decks. Plus, the history of lands with additional permanent types is pretty strong. Like, the artifact lands, the original ones, are actually banned all the way back to Modern. That's how strong they are. And we see even, like, the tapped indestructible ones from Modern Horizons 2, even those see play in artifact decks, and those enter tapped. So I feel like Valgavoth's Lair definitely has potential to show up in the right deck. The downside of this card is it still can die to enchantment removal. I'm pretty sure why they give it hexproof is they didn't want Demystify to be like 1 mana Stone Rain against it, but in Standard, Pick Your Poison exists. It doesn't actually target an enchantment. So imagine like turn 1 you Valgavoth's Lair, and then your opponent just like pick your poison, make you sacrifice. It sounds absolutely brutal. The other thing I want to mention about this card that isn't as obvious is it's actually a very sneaky good Delirium card for Standard because it gets 2 relatively challenging card types into your graveyard. So I know in older formats with fetch lands, getting a land on the graveyard, not very hard, but in Standard, unless you're playing janky fetch lands, it's actually not that easy to just naturally get a land in your graveyard. But if you can mill this over, you have a land in your graveyard, and it's also an enchantment in your graveyard. So by itself, it's going to get you halfway to turning on your Demonic Counsel or any of your Delirium stuff. So I think it's sneaky powerful there as well. In Commander, obviously Enchantress decks, the primary home for this card, just to boost your enchantment synergies we were talking about. But there's some other possibilities, like having a hexproof land is pretty neat with something like Noyandar that wants to like make this huge land creature and use that to try to win the game. Having a land that has hexproof, pretty nice upside there that your opponent can't just kill it. It's also sneaky with like Baba Lasagna, where you're able to sacrifice this land as 2 different permanent types to draw a bunch of cards. So keep those synergies in mind too. But I really like this card. I feel like Wizards went relatively safe with this. Like only making 1 color and coming into play tapped does make it relatively safe. So I don't think this card's busted. If this card came into play untapped or was like dual land, then I'd be thinking this card might be like really, really pushed. But I do think that having a land that is an enchantment has enough upside in the right deck that it can still do some really, really strong things in certain archetypes. Moving into the realm of lower rarity cards, we just talked about Scrabbling Skullcrab and the Eerie mechanic, but the cards we're shouting out, 1 mana 0/3, Crab Skeleton, and it says whenever an enchantment you control enters, or when you fully unlock a room, target player mills 2 cards. So this is essentially an upgraded Sage of Mysteries, and I don't think this card's busted or anything, but it's worth keeping in mind because it can target you, and there might be some sort of deck that just wants to fill its graveyard super quick and then like reanimate a bunch of enchantments or something. If that happens, Scrabbling Skullcrab could be really good. We've seen these 1 mana mill creatures see a lot of play in the past, obviously harder than like a Hedron Crab to mill your opponent with because having an enchantment entering is harder than having a land enter, but still I could see this card having uses in a weird enchantment deck that's looking to fill its graveyard. We also got Unwanted Remake, which does describe a lot of horror movie sequels, and this card I think people are maybe a little too hyped about. So it's a 1 mana instant. You destroy a creature and its controller manifest threat. So they look at their top 2 cards, put 1 into play as a face down 2/2, can flip it up for its mana cost if it's a creature. So this card, it's kind of reminiscent of Reality Shift, right? Which is legitimately a almost staple level blue removal spell in Commander. The reason I'm not excited about Unwanted Remake is it's white instead of blue. The reason Reality Shift sees play in Commander isn't because it's an especially good removal removal spell, it's because blue is especially bad at targeted removal, so it's kind of like the best of bad options. White, on the other hand, has the best removal. You got swords and path and so many different options, so I would be surprised if this card was actually good enough to see much play, although it is cute that you can blow up one of your own creatures to manifest like in response to a removal spell or something, so maybe you can sneak a little upside out of it there. But I imagine this card probably doesn't really make the cut anywhere. Would be much more exciting if it was blue rather than white. We also got another new mechanic in Survival. So Survival is a mechanic that triggers at the beginning of your second main phase, when it used to be the post-combat main phase, if the creature is tapped. So we see Veteran Survivor, a 1-mana 2/1, so a Savannah Lions. It has Survival. If it's tapped at the beginning of your second main phase, you can exile one target card from a graveyard, and then as long as there's 3 or more cards exiled with it, it gets +3/+3 and has hexproof. So this card itself, it's a fine aggro threat. It does have some upsides. It reminds me a little bit of Mardu Woe Reaper, which was this Savannah Lions, but when another warrior entered, you could exile stuff from the graveyard, and the incidental graveyard exiling is kind of nice. I don't know if Savannah Lions is like that good anymore. Is this enough upside? It eventually does turn into a 5/4 hexproof if you can trigger its survivor mode a few times, which is a pretty big threat. So we'll have to see if it actually makes it. It is worth mentioning the survival works really well with crewing and with saddling, just ways that you can tap your creatures without getting them into combat. And that might be the way to play Veteran Survivor. Isn't so much to like try to beat down with the Savannah Lions, which might not be that realistic, but if you can use this to crew a schooner a few times and grow it into a 5/4 hexproofer, then you kind of actually got a stew going. We also got the return of Norrin, and Norrin Swift Survival is. So Norrin, a 1-mana 2/1 legendary human coward. It can't block because cowards can't block, we all know that. And whenever a creature you control becomes blocked, you can exile it, and you may play that card from exile this turn. So Norrin, I think, is actually kind of intriguing in a mono-red aggro deck. So you get the Savannah Lion stats, and how I'm imagining this plays out is you play all your cheap red creatures, and with the Norrin out, you're able to just swing with your entire team, knowing that some of your creatures would normally trade off in combat, but thanks to Norrin, the things that your opponent blocks and is going to kill, you can just exile those and then recast them on your second main phase and be able to keep them back into play. So it's a way that you can kind of swing with your entire team, even if your opponent has good blocks, and know that you're not going to lose creatures. So I don't think this is like a staple 4 of, but I can see the uses of this in some sort of red aggro deck. Also, I guess you could theoretically reuse ETBs or something, although remember, your opponent gets to choose if they block, so it's going to be hard to get them to block your Muldrift or whatever if they don't want to. But still, I think this card is actually kind of intriguing. Plus, it's cool to see Norrin making its first return in what, like 20 years or something. We also got just some draft chaff style stuff, although Fear of Lost Teeth, I swear to God, every set's an unset now. Like, that's the most unsetty card that I've ever seen. Although I actually Googled this, and apparently the fear of losing your teeth is actually one of people's biggest nightmares, which I didn't realize that was a real thing, but apparently that is actually true. We also got all the face commanders from the commander precons. Not going to go in depth on Zimone and Valgavoth and Winter and Aminatu. Tomer, though, is doing a video covering all these on the commander YouTube, so make sure to check that out. That should be up by now as well. We also got, finally, a few cards that are promos for a special bundle Wizards is making for Halloween season. So they're doing a new Nightmare bundle that is a little different than the normal Fat Packer bundle. Instead of being 9 set booster packs, in this special bundle, you get 6 set booster packs, 2 collector booster packs, and then 1 Nightmare pack. And these Nightmare packs only contain 6 cards. Actually, you're only going to get 2 cards in the pack, but you're going to get one of the top row of cards, the Living Death, Archon of Cruelty, Goryo's Vengeance, and then one of the bottom row of cards, Dam, Cryptcast, and Exhume. So they're kind of like the promos in those packs. So you're not guaranteed to get all 3 of them. You only get one of each of those rows, but every one that you buy, you're going to get one of those. Worth mentioning, Goryo's Vengeance is like a $40 card or something. So there actually is some value there. And it seems like the bundles I looked up on Amazon, it seems like they're going for $80. And I think it's probably worth it if you have the extra money compared to a normal bundle. I think normal bundles are like $40, $45. I think paying an extra $35-ish to upgrade to 2 collector boosters over set boosters and get a shot at these promos probably makes it worth buying if you were in the market for a bundle. Only downside is they don't release until just before Halloween, so about a month after, almost a month after the set proper. So if you're trying to get cards right away at release, not going to help you there, but definitely worth keeping in mind during the Halloween season. Plus the promos, they do look pretty sweet. The art in this set is just so spectacular. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Duskmourn spoilers for today. And I gotta say, after getting a first real look at these cards, this set is going to be sweet. My hype level is through the roof. The art is amazing. Might be some of my favorite art in a Magic set ever throughout this set. It's just so creepy and good. The designs are super cool. Cards look strong, but maybe not super overpowered, which is probably a good place to be. I really love seeing things that synergize with older sets in Standard, seeing like more face down stuff to go with Murders at Karlov Manor and so forth. So I like how they're trying to tie these sets together a little bit, which is something we've really been missing in Standard. So all around so far, my hype level has greatly increased after seeing these spoilers, but let me know what you think. What do you think of this set so far? What's your favorite card spoil today? Let me know in the comments, and I'll be back tomorrow with even more Duskmourn spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, check out the video about the deck that bored people to death on the Pro Tour, or maybe this week's Against the Odds, where we look to blink our way through Standard with Fecund Green Shell.